The blood trickling from Lillian O'Connor's split lip mingled with her tears as she stumbled down the moonlit dirt road leading out of St. Louis. The year was 1878, and the spring night air carried a chill that seeped through her thin cotton dress. Her hands trembled as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, desperate to hide the angry purple marks that wrapped around her neck like a macabre necklace. Behind her, the silhouette of her husband's saloon loomed against the night sky, its raucous sounds fading with each desperate step she took. Theodore Blackwell had promised her the world when he'd married her 3 years ago. Instead, he'd delivered her into hell. Tonight had been the worst baiting yet. She could still feel the press of his fingers against her windpipe, the way her vision had darkened at the edges before she'd managed to break free. She'd grabbed what little money she had hidden away and fled while he was passed out drunk in their bedroom above the saloon. Lillian had no destination in mind, only the burning desire to put as much distance as possible between herself and the monster she'd married. The road stretched before her, empty and foreboding, but still less frightening than what lay behind. The distant sound of hoofbeats made her heart stutter in her chest. Had Theodore awakened to find her gone? Was he coming after her already? Panic seized her as she frantically looked for somewhere to hide. The road offered little cover, with only a few scattered trees and bushes lining its edges. As the rider drew closer, Lillian ducked behind a large oak tree, pressing her back against its rough bark. She held her breath, praying to remain unseen as the horse and rider approached. The steady clip-clop of hooves slowed, then stopped altogether just yards from her hiding place. Lillian squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to become invisible. "Miss, you all right out here?" The voice was deep, with a slight drawl, but gentle in a way Theodore's never was. Still, Lillian remained frozen, too terrified to respond. "I saw someone on the road just now," the voice continued. "If you're in trouble, I'd like to help." A twig snapped beneath Lillian's foot as she shifted position, and she heard the creak of leather as the rider dismounted. Heavy footsteps approached her hiding place. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said softly, "but it's dangerous for anyone to be out here alone at night." Gathering what little courage she had left, Lillian stepped out from behind the tree, ready to run if necessary. The moonlight revealed a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, his face partially shadowed. He wore a long duster coat over simple clothes, with boots dusty from the road. At his hip was a holstered revolver. When he saw her face, the man's expression shifted from concern to alarm. Even in the dim light, her injuries were plain to see. His eyes moved from her split lip to the bruises on her neck, and his jaw tightened. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of anger that made Lillian take a step back. "Please," she whispered, her voice raspy from the damage to her throat. "I just need to get away." The man's posture softened immediately. "My name's Quentin Garrett," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. I can offer you shelter for the night, or take you wherever you need to go." Lillian hesitated. Going with a stranger held its own dangers, but the thought of Theodore finding her was more terrifying still. "He'll come looking for me," she said, glancing anxiously back toward town. Quentin followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Your husband did this." Lillian nodded, unable to speak the words aloud. Quentin's expression hardened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "He'll never touch you again," he said with quiet certainty. "Not while I draw breath." Something in the steadiness of his voice, the unwavering conviction in his words, made Lillian believe him. She'd known this man for mere minutes, yet she felt safer in his presence than she had in years. "I don't know where to go," she admitted. "Let me help you up," Quentin said, extending his hand but keeping a respectful distance. "My horse can carry us both." Lillian looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. In the moonlight, she could see him clearly now. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with a weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun. His eyes were kind, and there was no trace of the meanness she'd grown accustomed to seeing in Theodore's gaze. Taking a leap of faith, she placed her hand in his, noticing how careful he was not to grip too tightly as he led her to his horse. "This is Renegade," Quentin said, patting the large bay gelding's neck. "He's steady as they come." With gentle hands, he helped Lillian mount, then swung up behind her. He kept a respectful distance, making sure she was comfortable before taking the reins. "I don't even know your name, miss," he said as they set off at a gentle walk. "Lillian," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lillian O'Connor, though I was Lillian Blackwell for the past 3 years. "Well, Miss O'Connor," Quentin said, the use of her maiden name not lost on her, "you're safe now, I promise you that." As they rode away from St. Louis, Lillian felt a curious mixture of terror and relief. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she dared to hope it might be something better than what she was leaving behind. Quentin's ranch appeared on the horizon just as the first pink streaks of dawn were lighting the sky. It was modest but well kept, with a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings spread across the rolling landscape. A split-rail fence surrounded a corral where several horses grazed peacefully. "It's not much," Quentin said as they approached, "but it's peaceful here." Lillian could hardly believe that such tranquility existed so close to the chaos of her former life. As they rode up to the main house, a woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Quentin Garrett," she called out, her tone scolding but affectionate. "I expected you back hours ago. What in heaven's name?" She broke off when she noticed Lillian, her expression shifting from irritation to concern. "This is my Aunt Martha," Quentin explained to Lillian as he helped her down from the horse. "She helps keep the place running and makes sure I don't starve." Martha hurried down the steps, her eyes taking in Lillian's disheveled appearance and the visible injuries on her face and neck. With a wordless nod of understanding to her nephew, she gently took Lillian's arm. "Come inside, dear," she said kindly. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed." Quentin handed Renegade's reins to a young ranch hand who had appeared from the barn. "Take care of him, Charlie," he said. "He's had a long night." Inside the house, Martha led Lillian to a small bedroom off the main living area. "You can rest here," she said, pulling back the quilt on the bed. "I'll bring some warm water for washing and see if I can find you some clean clothes." Left alone, Lillian sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of the past few hours. The room was simple but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the rolling plains beyond the ranch. It was the farthest she'd been from St. Louis since her wedding day. A soft knock at the door announced Martha's return. She carried a basin of steaming water, a cloth, and what appeared to be a bundle of clothing. "These might be a bit big," she said, placing the clothes on the bed. "They belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Kansas City." "Thank you," Lillian said, the words catching in her still sore throat. "You're very kind to help a stranger." Martha's face softened. "Anyone running from what you're running from isn't a stranger, child. They're just someone who needs help." She patted Lillian's hand. "Clean up, change, and then come to the kitchen when you're ready. You look like you could use a proper meal." When Martha had gone, Lillian washed away the dirt and dried blood from her face and hands, wincing as the cloth touched her split lip. The cool water felt heavenly against her bruised skin. She changed into the borrowed dress, a simple blue calico that hung a bit loosely on her frame, and combed her fingers through her tangled auburn hair. In the kitchen, she found Martha at the stove and Quentin seated at a large wooden table. He stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her. "You look better," he said, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in a long time," Lillian admitted, taking the offered seat. It was true, despite her injuries and the lingering fear. There was a strange sense of lightness in being away from Theodore's oppressive presence. Martha placed a plate before her, piled high with scrambled eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Eat," she instructed. "Food always helps in times of trouble." The first bite reminded Lillian how hungry she was. She couldn't remember the last full meal she'd eaten. Theodore's rages often sent her to bed without supper. "I need to ask you something difficult, Miss O'Connor," Quentin said when she'd eaten about half her breakfast. "Is your husband likely to come looking for you?" Lillian's fork clattered against her plate as her hand began to tremble. "Yes," she whispered. "Theodore doesn't let go of what he considers his." Quentin exchanged a glance with his aunt. "Theodore Blackwell," he said, not really a question. "He owns the Frontier Saloon in town." Lillian nodded, surprised. "You know him?" "I know of him," Quentin replied, his expression darkening. "He has a reputation among the decent folk in St. Louis, and it's not a good one." Martha made a disapproving noise as she joined them at the table with her own plate. "That man's been a menace since he arrived from Chicago 5 years ago. Bought that saloon with money no one's quite sure how he came by." "He told me he was a successful businessman," Lillian said quietly. "I had no reason not to believe him when we met. He was charming." "Men like that often are at first," Martha said, patting Lillian's hand. "You're not the first woman to be deceived by a silver-tongued child, and you won't be the last. How did you meet him?" Quentin asked, his tone careful, non-judgmental. Lillian took a sip of coffee before answering. "I was working as a teacher at the school in Jefferson City. He came through town on business and attended a community social where I was playing the piano." She stared into her cup, remembering. "He courted me for 6 weeks, sending flowers, writing letters full of poetry and promises. My parents were impressed by his apparent wealth and standing." "And after you married?" Martha prompted gently when Lillian fell silent. "He changed the moment we returned to St. Louis after the wedding," Lillian said, her voice hollow. "The first time he hit me was because I spilled tea on one of his shirts. He apologized afterward, crying, promising it would never happen again." A bitter laugh escaped her. "They always promise that, don't they?" Quentin's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "And your family?" "My father died last year. My mother moved to California to live with my brother." Lillian swallowed hard. "Theodore made sure I couldn't write to them without him reading the letters first. Eventually, I stopped trying." "You're not alone anymore," Martha said firmly. "You can stay here as long as you need." "I can't impose," Lillian began, but Quentin cut her off. "It's no imposition. This ranch is plenty big, and we could use an extra pair of hands." His eyes met hers across the table. "Unless you have somewhere else you'd rather go," Lillian shook her head. "I have nowhere, and no money beyond what I managed to hide away, about $15. "Then it's settled," Martha said, rising to clear the dishes. "You'll stay here until you decide what you want to do next." "What about Theodore?" Lillian asked, the fear creeping back into her voice. "He won't just let me go." Quentin's expression hardened. "Let me worry about Theodore Blackwell," he said. "Right now you need rest." "When was the last time you slept properly?" Lillian couldn't remember. Sleep had been a luxury in a household where she never knew when Theodore's rage might erupt. "Go back to bed," Martha urged. "Everything will seem clearer after you've had some sleep." Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed Lillian, and she didn't protest as Martha led her back to the small bedroom. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she heard was Quentin's voice, low and determined, speaking to his aunt in the hallway. "I'm riding into town. There are some things I need to take care of." The sun was high in the sky when Lillian finally awoke, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic seized her as she thought Theodore would be angry that she'd slept so late. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. She found Martha in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. The older woman looked up with a smile when Lillian entered. "There you are. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away, which would have been just fine, mind you. You clearly needed the rest." "Where's Mr. Garrett?" Lillian asked, glancing around. Martha's smile faltered slightly. "He rode into town early this morning, said he had business to attend to." Fear clutched at Lillian's heart. "He's not confronting Theodore, is he?" "Quentin has a good head on his shoulders," Martha assured her, though she didn't directly answer the question. "He won't do anything foolish." But Lillian wasn't so sure. The look in Quentin's eyes when he'd spoken of Theodore had been cold and determined. She'd seen men with that look before. It usually preceded violence. "Let me help you," she offered, eager for distraction from her worries. "I'm quite good in the kitchen." "Splendid," Martha said, gesturing to the vegetables on the counter. "You can start by peeling those potatoes for the stew." As they worked side by side, Martha told Lillian about the ranch and how Quentin had come to own it. "It belonged to my brother Quentin's father. When John and his wife died of fever 6 years ago, Quentin took over. He was just 24 then, fresh from serving with the cavalry out west. He's built it into something special, this place." "He seems like a good man," Lillian ventured. Martha's smile was knowing. "The best I know. Never seen him lose his temper, not even when the bull broke through the fence and trampled half the vegetable garden last summer." She paused in her kneading. "That's not to say he can't be fierce when the situation calls for it. He fought in some of the last Indian conflicts, you know. Came back changed, quieter, but with a stronger sense of what's right." Lillian thought about the gentle way Quentin had helped her onto his horse, how careful he'd been not to frighten her. It was hard to imagine him in battle. "Has he ever been married?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Martha chuckled. "No, though not for lack of young ladies trying to catch his eye. He's been focused on making this ranch successful. Too busy for courting, he always says." She gave Lillian a sidelong glance. "Though I've always thought he was just waiting for the right woman to come along." Lillian busied herself with the potatoes, not sure how to respond. The idea that she could ever trust a man again seemed impossible after what she'd endured with Theodore. And yet, there had been something in Quentin's steady gaze that had made her feel safe for the first time in years. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. "It's Quentin," she said, relief evident in her voice. Moments later, the door opened and Quentin entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. His expression was somber, and Lillian noticed with alarm that his knuckles were raw and bruised. "What happened?" Martha demanded, rushing to examine his hands. "Nothing that wasn't necessary," Quentin replied, his eyes finding Lillian's across the room. "I paid a visit to your husband, Miss O'Connor." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Is he?" "Very much alive," Quentin assured her, though not particularly happy at the moment. He flexed his injured hand. "We had what you might call a difference of opinion regarding his treatment of you." "You fought him," Lillian whispered, horrified at the thought of Quentin putting himself in danger on her behalf. "I expressed my sentiments in a manner he was likely to understand," Quentin said with a hint of grim satisfaction. "But that's not the important part. I also spoke with Sheriff Davis and Judge Wilson." Martha bustled to the stove, pouring hot water into a basin. "Sit down, Quentin," and let me tend to those hands while you explain." Quentin complied, wincing slightly as he submerged his bruised knuckles in the warm water. "Judge Wilson is an old friend of my father's," he explained to Lillian. "When I told him about your situation and showed him my deputy's badge from my time with the territorial marshals, he agreed to issue an order of protection." "A what?" Lillian asked, confused. "It means that Theodore Blackwell is legally prohibited from approaching you or this property. If he violates that order, Sheriff Davis has the authority to arrest him immediately." Hope flickered in Lillian's chest, though she was afraid to let it grow. "Theodore doesn't respect the law much," she said quietly. "That's why I made sure he understood the consequences would be more than legal if he came near you again." Quentin's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath the words. "I also informed several of my friends in town about the situation. They'll be keeping an eye on the Frontier Saloon and letting me know if Blackwell appears to be making any moves in this direction." Martha tusked as she dried Quentin's hands and wrapped a clean cloth around the worst of the abrasions. "You always were one to take matters into your own hands," she scolded, but there was pride in her voice. "I also retrieved these," Quentin added, reaching into his saddlebag and pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table in front of Lillian. "I thought you might want them back." With trembling fingers, Lillian unwrapped the bundle to find her mother's silver locket, the small book of poetry her father had given her on her 16th birthday, and the few pieces of jewelry that had been hers before her marriage. "How did you—" she began, tears welling in her eyes. "I may have mentioned to Blackwell that it would be in his best interest to return your personal property," Quentin said with a shrug. "He seemed to agree after some discussion." Lillian clutched the locket to her chest, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought I'd see these again." "There's one more thing," Quentin said, his expression turning serious. "Judge Wilson said that given the circumstances, you have grounds for an annulment of your marriage. He's willing to hear the case whenever you're ready." Lillian stared at him in disbelief. "An annulment? Is that possible? In cases of extreme cruelty, yes. Especially given that you've been married less than 7 years and have no children." Quentin's eyes were compassionate. "It would mean you'd be free of him legally, as well as physically. You could reclaim your maiden name and start fresh." The possibility of true freedom was almost too much to comprehend. For 3 years, Lillian had believed her only escape from Theodore would be death, either his or her own. The idea that she could simply walk away, with the law on her side, seemed like a miracle. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Martha assured her, patting her shoulder. "You're safe here for as long as you need to be." Quentin rose from the table. "I should check on the herd. Charlie mentioned one of the pregnant mares seemed restless this morning." "I'll have supper ready by sundown," Martha called after him as he headed for the door. As he reached the threshold, Quentin paused, turning back to Lillian. "Miss O'Connor," he said, his voice gentle, "I meant what I said last night. He'll never touch you again. You have my word on that." With that, he was gone, leaving Lillian to absorb the enormous changes that had occurred in her life in less than 24 hours. She looked down at her mother's locket, running her thumb over its familiar silver surface. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something dangerous: hope. The days that followed fell into a peaceful rhythm that was balm to Lillian's wounded spirit. She helped Martha with the cooking and cleaning, grateful for the older woman's steady, undemanding presence. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the vast Missouri sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Quentin was often busy with ranch work, but he always made time to check on Lillian, his quiet concern a constant reassurance. Sometimes he would join them after supper, telling stories about the day's work or reading aloud from one of the books in his modest library. A week after her arrival, Lillian noticed the bruises on her neck had faded to a sickly yellow, and her split lip had nearly healed. The physical wounds were disappearing, though the emotional ones remained raw. She still startled at sudden noises and found herself instinctively shrinking from quick movements. One evening, as Martha retired early with a headache, Lillian found herself alone with Quentin on the porch. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures. "You seem stronger," Quentin observed finally. "There's more color in your face." Lillian smiled faintly. "Your aunt's cooking deserves much of the credit for that. I didn't realize how little I'd been eating until I came here." "He starved you." Quentin's voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Not deliberately most of the time," Lillian clarified, "but meals became difficult. If I cooked something he didn't like, or if he was in a particular mood, it was safer to go without." Quentin's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "I shouldn't make you talk about it." "No, it's all right." Lillian surprised herself with the realization that it was true. "Sometimes talking helps make it less frightening in my memory." Quentin seemed to consider this. "My father used to say that the worst ghosts are the ones we keep locked inside." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Quentin agreed, his eyes distant. "He built this ranch from nothing but a patch of dirt and a dream, taught me everything I know about horses, cattle, and being a decent man." He glanced at Lillian. "He would have been appalled at how Blackwell treated you. My father believed that a man's duty was to protect those weaker than himself, never to exploit them." "I used to believe men like your father were common," Lillian said softly. "Before Theodore, I never imagined. I never knew men could be so cruel to those they claimed to love." "Not all men are like him," Quentin said quietly, "though I know that must be hard to believe right now." Lillian studied his profile in the fading light, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the kind eyes that had never once looked at her with anything but respect. "I'm starting to remember that," she admitted. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that neither was ready to name. Quentin cleared his throat and looked away first. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, changing the subject. "Martha mentioned you were a teacher before you married. Is that something you might want to return to?" Lillian hadn't allowed herself to think much about the future yet. The present being safe, healing, had consumed her attention. "I loved teaching," she said thoughtfully. "The children, their eagerness to learn, watching their faces light up when they mastered something new. It was deeply rewarding." "The school in St. Louis is looking for a teacher," Quentin mentioned casually, though Lillian sensed it wasn't as offhand as he made it seem. "Mrs. Jenkins is expecting a baby and plans to retire once it arrives." "You've been making inquiries on my behalf?" Lillian asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. Quentin shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just thought you might want options, for when you're ready to move on." The implication that she might leave the ranch brought an unexpected pang to Lillian's heart. In just a week, this place had become a sanctuary, and the thought of leaving it, leaving Quentin and Martha, was surprisingly painful. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to face St. Louis again." "Theodore would be a fool to bother you if you were working at the school," Quentin finished firmly. "Half the town council has children attending, including Sheriff Davis's twins. You'd be well protected." Lillian smiled at his determination. "You've thought this through, haven't you?" "I just want you to know that you have choices now," Quentin said. "Your life is your own again, or it can be, once the annulment is finalized." The mention of the annulment reminded Lillian of the letter Judge Wilson had sent, delivered by a ranch hand who'd been to town the previous day. The judge had requested her presence for a hearing the following week. "I'm nervous about the hearing," she confessed. "What if Theodore contests it? What if the judge doesn't believe me?" "I'll be right beside you," Quentin promised. "And Theodore would be a fool to contest it after the evidence I presented to Judge Wilson." "Evidence?" Quentin looked slightly uncomfortable. "The bruises on your neck were compelling. I asked Doc Harris to examine you that first night while you were sleeping. He documented your injuries and signed an affidavit for the judge." He hesitated. "I hope you don't mind that I took that liberty. I wanted to make sure there would be no legal obstacles to your freedom." Rather than feeling violated, Lillian felt a rush of gratitude at his foresight. "Thank you," she said simply, "for thinking of everything I couldn't." "It's the least I could do," Quentin replied, his voice rough with emotion. As darkness fell completely, Lillian found herself reluctant to end this moment of connection between them. But exhaustion was catching up to her. She still tired easily, her body healing from years of abuse. "I should get some rest," she said finally, rising from her chair. "Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Garrett." "Quentin," he corrected gently. "After everything, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" His smile in the moonlight made something flutter in Lillian's chest, a feeling she thought had died years ago. "Good night, Quentin," she said softly. "Good night, Lillian. Sleep well." As she made her way to her room, Lillian realized that for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she wasn't afraid of what the next day might bring. Instead, she found herself looking forward to it. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and warm. Lillian dressed in her best borrowed outfit, a navy blue dress that Martha had altered to fit her slender frame. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair, which had begun to regain its natural luster after a week of proper meals and restful sleep. A soft knock at her door announced Martha's arrival. The older woman carried a small wooden box, which she placed on the dresser. "I thought you might like to wear this today," she said, opening the box to reveal a simple silver brooch in the shape of a daisy. "It was my mother's, and it always brought me courage when I needed it." Lillian was touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, but I couldn't—" "Nonsense," Martha interrupted, already pinning the brooch to Lillian's collar. "Consider it borrowed if that makes you feel better. But every woman deserves something pretty when she's facing a challenge." When Lillian emerged from her room, she found Quentin waiting in the main room, dressed in his best clothes, clean dark trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and for a moment Lillian was struck by how handsome he looked. "You ready for this?" he asked, offering his arm. Lillian took a deep breath and nodded, placing her hand on his arm. The solid strength of him was reassuring. "As ready as I'll ever be." The ride into St. Louis was tense but uneventful. Lillian found herself growing more anxious as familiar landmarks appeared, signaling their approach to town. By the time they reached the main street, her grip on Quentin's arm had tightened considerably. "It's all right," he murmured, covering her hand with his own. "I'm right here." The courthouse was a modest two-story brick building in the center of town. As they ascended the steps, Lillian's eyes darted nervously around, half expecting Theodore to appear at any moment. Judge Wilson was waiting for them in his chambers, a portly man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He greeted Quentin warmly and extended the same courtesy to Lillian. "Mrs. Blackwell," he began, then caught himself. "Or would you prefer Miss O'Connor?" "Miss O'Connor, please," Lillian said quietly. The judge nodded approvingly. "Very well. I've reviewed the affidavit from Dr. Harris as well as the statements from Mr. Garrett and Sheriff Davis. The evidence of mistreatment is substantial and disturbing." His expression softened. "I want to assure you that this hearing is a mere formality. Your annulment will be granted today." Relief flooded through Lillian, making her knees weak. Quentin's steady hand at her elbow kept her upright. "What about Theodore?" she asked. "Will he need to be present?" "Mr. Blackwell was served with papers last week," Judge Wilson explained. "He had the opportunity to contest the annulment but has not filed any response. In fact," he added with a hint of satisfaction, "I'm told he's been quite subdued since his conversation with Mr. Garrett." Quentin shifted uncomfortably beside her, but didn't comment. The hearing itself was brief and straightforward. Lillian answered the judge's questions about her marriage and the abuse she had suffered, her voice growing stronger with each response. When she described the night she had fled, the bruises still fresh on her neck, Judge Wilson's expression darkened with anger. "No woman should endure such treatment," he declared, signing the final document with a flourish. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Missouri, I hereby declare your marriage to Theodore Blackwell null and void. You are legally restored to your maiden name and status." "Thank you, Your Honor," Lillian whispered, tears of relief filling her eyes. As they left the courthouse, Lillian felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher, now that she was truly free. "What would you like to do now?" Quentin asked as they stepped onto the street. "We could have lunch at the hotel before heading back to the ranch." Before Lillian could answer, a familiar voice called out from across the street, sending ice through her veins. "Well, if it isn't my runaway wife and her knight in shining armor." Theodore Blackwell stood in front of his saloon, his usual immaculate appearance somewhat diminished. His eye was blackened, and a healing cut bisected his lip souvenirs, Lillian presumed, from his discussion with Quentin. Despite his injuries, his face wore the same cold smile that had always preceded his worst outbursts. Quentin stepped slightly in front of Lillian, his posture tense. "She's not your wife anymore, Blackwell. The judge just granted the annulment. You'd be wise to go back inside and forget you ever saw us." Theodore's smile didn't waver, though his eyes hardened. "Is that so? Well, congratulations, Lillian. Though I must say, you didn't waste any time finding a replacement, did you? Always were a bit too friendly with other men." The familiar accusation, one he'd used to justify countless beatings, made Lillian flinch. But then something unexpected happened. Anger, hot and fierce, rose within her, burning away the fear. "You never knew me at all, Theodore," she said, her voice steady as she stepped out from behind Quentin. "And you never will. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Theodore's face darkened with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "Choose your next words very carefully," Quentin interrupted, his hand moving to rest near his holstered gun. "There are witnesses all around, and I'd hate to have to explain to Sheriff Davis why I had to defend a lady's honor in broad daylight." For a tense moment, Theodore seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a forced laugh, he backed down. "Keep her, Garrett. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway." He turned to go back into the saloon, then paused to add over his shoulder, "But remember this, Lillian, St. Louis is a small town. I'll be watching." When he was gone, Lillian released a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she murmured to Quentin. "I didn't expect to see him." "You have nothing to apologize for," Quentin said firmly. "And you were magnificent. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on his face when you said that." Lillian managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing. "I think I'd like to go back to the ranch now, if you don't mind." "Of course," Quentin agreed, offering his arm once more. "Let's go home." Home. The word echoed in Lillian's mind as they rode out of town. Was that what the ranch had become to her? A place where she felt safe, valued, and increasingly at peace. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. She hadn't intended to stay permanently, and she didn't want to impose on Quentin and Martha's generosity indefinitely. "Something on your mind?" Quentin asked, noticing her preoccupation. Lillian hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "I was just thinking about what comes next. Now that the annulment is finalized, I should probably make plans. Plans to leave." There was an odd note in Quentin's voice that she couldn't quite identify. "I can't stay at your ranch forever," Lillian pointed out gently. "You and Martha have been incredibly kind, but I need to find my own way now." Quentin was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "What if I asked you to stay?" he said finally, his voice so low she almost didn't hear him. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. "As what?" she asked carefully. "As whatever you want to be," Quentin replied, turning to meet her gaze. "A teacher for the children on nearby farms, Martha's companion. Or—" He trailed off, seeming to lose his courage. "Or," Lillian prompted, barely breathing. Quentin reined his horse to a stop at a bend in the road that offered a sweeping view of the countryside. In the distance, his ranch was visible, peaceful and inviting against the backdrop of rolling hills. "I know it's too soon," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "You've been through hell, and the last thing you need is a man presuming upon your situation. But I can't help how I feel, Lillian." She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "From the moment I saw you on that road, something in me recognized something in you," Quentin continued, choosing his words carefully. "Not just that you needed help, but that you were someone special, someone strong enough to survive what would have broken many others." "I don't feel very strong," Lillian admitted. "But you are," Quentin insisted. "And each day I see more of that strength emerging as the fear recedes." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say poorly is that I care for you, deeply, and selfishly I don't want you to leave." Lillian stared at him, overwhelmed by his confession. Part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind and tell him that she felt the same inexplicable connection. But another part, the part that still bore the emotional scars of Theodore's manipulation, hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly. "Everything is still so raw, and I'm still finding my way back to myself." Instead of disappointment, understanding dawned in Quentin's eyes. "I'm not asking for a declaration or a commitment," he assured her. "Just time. Stay at the ranch, continue healing, and let's see where this path leads us. No pressure, no expectations beyond friendship, unless you decide you want more." His offer was so different from Theodore's whirlwind courtship, so respectful of her needs and her healing process, that Lillian felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'd like that," she whispered. "To stay, and to see where the path leads." Quentin's smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. "Then that's settled," he said simply, and they continued on their way, a new understanding between them that required no further words. Over the following weeks, life at the ranch settled into a comfortable routine, but with a new undercurrent of possibility that made each day feel fresh and full of promise. True to his word, Quentin never pressed Lillian for more than she was ready to give, content to let their relationship develop naturally. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending the vegetable garden, and caring for the animals. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch, talking for hours about their pasts, their dreams, and increasingly, their shared future. Lillian discovered a talent for working with the horses, especially the more skittish ones that seemed to respond to her gentle patience. Quentin joked that she had a way of making even the most fearful creatures trust her, and they both recognized the deeper truth in his observation. One bright afternoon in late summer, Quentin found Lillian in the barn, brushing down a young filly that had recently been added to the herd. He leaned against the stall door, watching her work with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're good with her," he commented. "Better than Charlie or any of the other hands. She only lets you brush her without a fuss." Lillian smiled, stroking the filly's sleek neck. "She just needs to know she's safe. Don't you, girl?" The horse nickered softly in response. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Quentin said, his tone casual though there was a hint of nervousness in his posture. "The school board met yesterday in town. They're still looking for a teacher for the fall term." Lillian looked up, surprised. "I thought Mrs. Jenkins's cousin was taking the position." She was, but apparently she's decided to stay in Kansas City after all. Quentin cleared his throat. "I may have mentioned to Judge Wilson, who chairs the board, that you might be interested." "You did?" Lillian set down the brush, giving him her full attention. "Only if you want it," Quentin added quickly, "but I thought—" "Well, you mentioned how much you loved teaching, and the school is close enough that you could ride in each day from the ranch." The thoughtfulness of his gesture touched Lillian deeply. He had remembered her passion for teaching and had taken steps to help her pursue it again, without assuming he knew what was best for her. "What about Theodore?" she asked, the familiar anxiety flickering briefly. Though she had seen him occasionally in town over the past months, he had kept his distance, watching her with cold eyes but never approaching. "The school is on the opposite side of town from his saloon," Quentin pointed out. "And Sheriff Davis has made it clear to Blackwell that the protection order still stands. Besides," he added with a hint of his rare grin, "most of the children are from families who despise him as much as we do. He wouldn't dare cause trouble there." Lillian considered the offer, excitement building within her at the thought of returning to the work she loved. "I'd like to meet with Judge Wilson and discuss it," she decided. "If they truly want me, despite my history, then yes, I'd love to teach again." Quentin's face lit up with genuine pleasure at her decision. "He's expecting you tomorrow, if that's not too soon," Lillian laughed, suddenly feeling lighter than she had in years. "Not too soon at all." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Lillian found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been trapped in a nightmare, believing there was no escape. Now, she was free, healing, and on the verge of reclaiming the career she loved. And there was Quentin, patient, kind Quentin, who had never pushed or presumed, who had given her space to heal and find herself again. "Penny, for your thoughts," he asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Lillian turned to face him, taking in the strong profile that had become so dear to her. "I was thinking about the night we met," she said softly. "How desperate I was, how terrified, and how you promised that he would never touch me again." Quentin nodded, his expression solemn. "I meant it then, and I mean it now." "I know," Lillian said. "That's what I was thinking about, how you've kept that promise and so many others that you never even had to speak aloud. You promised me safety and respect and time to heal. And you've given me all of those things without ever asking for anything in return." Quentin shifted in his chair, looking almost embarrassed by her praise. "I didn't do anything special, Lillian, just what any decent man would do." "No," Lillian contradicted gently. "What you did, what you continue to do, is extraordinary. You saved me, not just from Theodore, but from the belief that all men are like him." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Lillian saw in Quentin's gaze the same deep feeling that had been growing in her own heart over these past months. "Lillian," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want to rush you, you're not," she interrupted, suddenly certain. "I'm ready, Quentin, ready to stop being afraid, ready to trust my heart again." She took a deep breath. "Ready to love again if you'll have me." In answer, Quentin reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and gentle, his calloused fingers entwining with hers as if they had always belonged together. "I've loved you since that first night," he confessed, "when you stepped out from behind that tree, bruised and terrified but still so brave. I just didn't want to burden you with my feelings until you were ready to hear them." Lillian felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. "I think I've loved you just as long," she whispered. "I just couldn't recognize it through all the fear." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Quentin leaned toward her. When his lips met hers, the kiss was as gentle as a summer breeze, a question, not a demand. Lillian answered by reaching up to touch his face, deepening the kiss with a certainty that surprised even her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "Does this mean you'll stay? Not just for the teaching position, but for us?" "Yes," Lillian replied without hesitation. "This is where I belong now, with you." The school term began in early September, and Lillian found herself thriving in the familiar role of teacher. The children adored her, and the parents respected her calm authority and genuine care for their offspring's education. Each day, she rode into town on the gentle mare Quentin had given her, taught her classes with growing confidence, and returned to the ranch in the afternoon, where either Quentin or Martha was always waiting to hear about her day. Theodore kept his distance, though Lillian occasionally caught glimpses of him watching her from the doorway of his saloon as she passed through town. The look in his eyes was still cold, but increasingly, there was something else there too, a grudging acknowledgement that she had escaped his control and built a new life beyond his reach. One crisp October evening, as Lillian sat grading papers at the kitchen table, Quentin entered with an air of nervous excitement about him. He had been into St. Louis that day on business, and she had expected him back hours ago. "Sorry I'm late," he said, removing his hat and coat. "I had an errand that took longer than expected." "Is everything all right?" Lillian asked, noting his unusual demeanor. "Better than all right," Quentin assured her, coming to stand beside her chair. "I have something I want to ask you, but first, I have news that I think you'll want to hear." Lillian set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "Theodore Blackwell is leaving St. Louis," Quentin announced. "Sold the saloon to Jeremiah Foster yesterday, and he's heading back east on tomorrow's train." Shock rendered Lillian momentarily speechless. "Are you certain?" She finally managed. Quentin nodded. "Sheriff Davis confirmed it. Apparently, the saloon hasn't been doing well lately, something about the respectable folks in town encouraging others to take their business elsewhere." The gleam in his eye suggested he might have had something to do with that campaign. "Foster plans to turn it into a proper hotel and dining establishment." The news was almost too good to believe. Though Theodore had kept his distance these past months, his presence in St. Louis had been a constant shadow on Lillian's newfound happiness. The knowledge that he would soon be gone, perhaps forever, lifted a burden she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying. "That's wonderful news," she breathed. "I thought you'd think so," Quentin agreed. He hesitated, then dropped to one knee beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Which brings me to what I wanted to ask you." Lillian's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "Quentin." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he admitted. "When I heard about Blackwell leaving, it felt like a sign that the last obstacle between us and our future was finally removed." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight and scattered it in tiny rainbows across their joined hands. "I love you, Lillian O'Connor," Quentin said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I love your strength, your kindness, your courage, and the way you've brought light back into this house and into my life. I want to spend the rest of my days by your side if you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome to speak for a moment. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, Quentin, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Quentin slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her alone. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Martha kept it safe all these years, waiting for the day I would find someone worthy of wearing it." "It's beautiful," Lillian said, admiring how it looked on her hand, a symbol not of possession, as her previous wedding ring had been, but of partnership and mutual respect. "I'll treasure it always." Quentin rose to his feet, drawing her up with him and into his arms. "I promise you, Lillian," he murmured against her hair, "that I will spend every day of our life together making sure you never regret saying yes." "I know you will," she replied, secure in the certainty of his love. "Just as I'll spend every day thankful for that night you found me on the road and promised me he would never touch me again." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other, a promise of love, respect, and a future brighter than either could have imagined in the darkness of their separate pasts. They were married on a perfect spring day the following April, with Martha beaming proudly from the front pew of St. Louis's small church and Judge Wilson officiating. Lillian wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair and Quentin's mother's ring on her finger. As they exchanged vows, Lillian looked into Quentin's eyes and saw reflected there all the love and security she had once thought forever beyond her reach. When he spoke the words, "I do," his voice rang with a conviction that left no doubt of his commitment. Their wedding celebration was held at the ranch, with neighbors and friends from miles around coming to wish them well. The schoolchildren had prepared a special song as a surprise, which they performed with such earnest enthusiasm that it brought fresh tears to Lillian's eyes. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the land that was now truly her home, Quentin found Lillian standing alone for a moment at the edge of the gathering, watching the celebration with contentment. "Mrs. Garrett," he said softly, coming to stand beside her, "how does it feel?" Lillian smiled up at her husband, marveling at how right the new name felt. "Perfect," she replied. "Absolutely perfect." Quentin slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I have something for you," he said, producing a folded document from his pocket. "A wedding gift of sorts." Curious, Lillian unfolded the paper and read it slowly, her eyes widening as she understood what she was holding. "Quentin, this is the deed to the ranch," he confirmed, "with both our names on it, equal partners in everything, just as it should be." The gesture touched her deeply. In a time when most women owned nothing in their own right, Quentin had given her legal claim to the home and land they shared, a tangible affirmation of the equality upon which their relationship was built. "Thank you," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "For this, and for everything." As they rejoined their guests, hand in hand, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. From the desperate flight down a moonlit road, bruised and terrified, to this sunlit celebration of love and new beginnings, it was a path she could never have imagined. Yet here she was, surrounded by friends, cherished by a man who valued her strength rather than seeking to break it, and looking forward to a future limited only by the horizons of their dreams. Later that night, as they stood together on the porch of the ranch house that was now truly their home, watching the last of their guests depart, Quentin pulled Lillian close. "Happy?" he asked simply. Lillian rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "You saved me, Quentin." "No," he corrected gently, tilting her face up to his. You saved yourself, Lillian. You found the courage to leave, to start over, to trust again. I was just fortunate enough to be there when you needed a friend. You were more than a friend, Lillian said softly. You were the promise of everything I thought I'd lost: safety, respect, the chance to be loved for who I truly am. Quentin's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of that promise. And you were the miracle I never expected, the woman who turned this house into a home again, who reminded me what it means to love and be loved in return. As they stood together in the moonlight, the future stretching before them like the vast Missouri plains, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that the terror that had once defined her life was truly behind her. In its place was a love stronger than fear, a partnership built on respect rather than control, and the promise of a lifetime of happiness in the arms of a man who had kept his word. Theodore would never touch her again, and neither would the shadow of the pain he had caused her. In the years that followed, that promise held true. Lillian continued teaching at the school, becoming beloved by generations of St. Louis children. Quentin's ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, growing into one of the most respected in the county. Martha lived with them until her peaceful passing at the age of 82, surrounded by the family she had helped to create. Their own family grew as well, first with the birth of their son, John, named for Quentin's father, and 2 years later, a daughter they called Rose, for the wildflowers that had been blooming on the night they met. As the children grew, they filled the ranch with laughter and life, learning from their parents the values of kindness, courage, and unwavering respect for others. Theodore Blackwell never returned to St. Louis. Occasionally, news would reach them of his whereabouts: Chicago, then New York, always moving, never finding the happiness he had destroyed in his need for control. But such news came less and less frequently, and eventually ceased altogether, as the memory of him faded from the town's consciousness. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Quentin surprised Lillian with a special gift, a beautifully bound journal containing the story of how they met, written in his careful hand. "So our children and grandchildren will remember," he explained, as she turned the pages with tears in her eyes, "that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest moments, and that courage can lead to happiness beyond imagining." That night, as they sat on the same porch where they had first confessed their love all those years ago, now weathered by time but still strong, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary life they had built together. "You ever think about that night on the road?" she asked, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. Quentin squeezed her fingers gently. "Often," he admitted. "I thank God every day that I happened to be riding that particular road at that particular moment." "As do I," Lillian said softly. "For without that moment, without you, I might never have known what it truly means to be loved." Quentin leaned over to kiss her, his touch as tender now as it had been on their wedding day. "And I might never have known what it means to be the man you deserve," he replied. "The man who kept his promise." As the stars appeared one by one in the vast Missouri sky, Lillian rested her head on her husband's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that some promises, once made and kept, create a foundation strong enough to support a lifetime of joy. And that sometimes, the greatest acts of courage lead not just to escape, but to the discovery of a love powerful enough to heal even the deepest wounds. The bruises on her neck had faded long ago, and with them, the terror in her eyes. In their place remained only the steady light of a woman who had found, in the arms of a good man, the home and the happiness she had always deserved.